When The Art of Avatar came out a couple of weeks ahead of the movie in 2009, I didn't pay much attention to it once I had a brief flick through and saw how meager the contents were, which ended up being a very good thing, as that meant I read this Making of Avatar book first, which came out a year later. That's something I might not have done had I sat down with the art book first and properly gauged what a terrible joke it was, and especially because the author of the art book is also co-author of the Making of book. But thankfully I was unaware of that when I picked up the Making of book, and even before opening it starts off on a better foot, showing some real promise. First, as I said, this was published almost a year after the movie came out, which suggests it wasn't rushed in an effort to tie in with the movie's release. Having said that, it was published about a month after the theatrical special edition re-release and a month before the collector's edition Blu-ray, so obviously tying in with those, but that's fine since the making of the movie had finished long before then. Additionally, unlike the art book, is that this one has a more appropriate bulk of 270 pages, though that looks promising. Time and again we've seen with books how that is often something of a deceitful illusion. Foreshadowing. But the most important thing before you even open the book up is the name of the other author on the cover, Jodie Duncan, as her adept and professional approach to the writing is one of the better examples you'll find in a making of book, at least in the areas where she dedicates an appropriate word count. When that's not the case, well, that's another matter. But suffice to say, it's the text that gives this book 90% of its value and quality, saving what is otherwise another unimpressive Avatar book. If I understand correctly, her co-author, Lisa Fitzpatrick, was responsible for the images and image captions, while Jodie Duncan wrote the main text. Jodie was the longtime editor and head writer of Cinefex magazine, which, if you're unfamiliar, is, or sadly now was, a visual effects journal, and based on its serious, high-quality writing and publishing practices, it's the only film-related magazine worth paying for as far as I'm concerned. So this does feel like a pretty good example of getting the right person for the job, since coming from that background is key to being able to explain the making of this incredibly tech and visual effects heavy movie. And that's the primary focus of this book, what gets the most attention: the technology, capturing of, and things related to the realization of the CG characters. So things like the performance capture, the head rigs, the virtual camera, 3D camera, simul camera, but don't let that intimidate you, because it's still aimed at a general readership and is all explained so well and so clearly, and I love the direct, no-nonsense style of the writing. I think there are two main ways to write a good making of book, though the perfect book would blend both, but one is to treat it as history, chronicling the production. This book certainly has a little of that, but mostly it takes the other approach, which is focusing on explaining how did they do that and why did they do that, which you would think is the foundation of every making of book, but unfortunately most of the people writing them lack even that level of common sense, or at the very least are unable to do so in a competent, meaningful way. Whereas that's where this book shines, with Jodie Duncan's Cinefex expertise coming to the fore, proving why these books shouldn't be written by any old journo or PR monkey, but someone who actually understands the core of what they're supposed to be doing, combined with the skill to execute it properly. And in this regard, it gives an excellent understanding of how certain aspects of the movie were made. Obviously, Avatar is a production that really lends itself to a good making of book, so that in itself contributes a significant advantage into what's on offer. That needs to be paired with an author and a book that knows how to live up to it and present it properly. My initial worry for a making of book on Avatar was that the general explanations and discussions of the text would result in a lot of the specific craft and artistry of the movie being overshadowed, and that definitely does happen in this book, but nowhere near as bad as I would have expected. This book does take the bird's eye view of making the movie. I would still classify the whole thing as a light overview, which usually I hate, but this is probably one of the better examples I've come across in terms of how it does the generalized overview stuff in a way that makes sense and still offers genuine insight into the making of the movie, because it's balanced out with tons of great detailed information and specific examples, though I would have liked more of that and less of a reliance on explanations that are too general or hypothetical, which is something the book does suffer from a little too much. But for Avatar specifically, this digest approach is appropriate, since the making of the movie pioneered and developed a lot of tools and techniques, so not only are they specifically relevant to the recording and making of this movie, but readers need those unfamiliar concepts explained in a general way so we can understand them. Now, over a decade later, reader, you wouldn't want to be reading another making-of book explaining those same things in the same way, otherwise every making-of book ends up being exactly the same. One thing I really enjoyed was how the book isn't afraid to mention when the technology didn't work the way they planned, specific challenges, or why they rejected some techniques in favor of others. Those provided examples of the imperfect reality and learning process of any endeavor where you're pushing the envelope and in uncharted territory. Now, the trade-off in getting such a good discussion of the tech stuff is that every other area of filmmaking outside of that is a lot shallower. Pretty much everything is touched on, the difference is just how much and how deep, but in almost all cases the answer to both is not enough. As I said, explaining as a general overview is sensible and works fine for discussing the technical tools and concepts, but the book occasionally uses too much of that same approach in discussing other areas of the film, but also in a way that is much shorter and an attempt to create a summary of the work done on the movie. It ends up being vague, non-specific, and or obvious, and starts to feel more like your typical poorly handled, unsatisfying making-of book. Though don't get me wrong, that stuff is still balanced out, in fact outweighed by all the specific examples and detailed, solid, fact-type information, and even though lacking in depth, it's almost always insightful, just not very satisfying or living up to the best parts of the book. Again, it's all certainly helped by Avatar being such an atypical production that even when only given a general and swift glimpse, it's very novel and interesting. But it does mean that things like the writing, Weta Workshop's contributions, costumes, props, physical set design, editing, sound, and so on, there's very little on any of that. Whether it's a passing sentence, paragraph, or page, it's very obvious there are a lot of areas that needed more. Music gets 2 paragraphs and nothing specific, but the biggest and most notable absentee is anything to do with the live-action filming. You'll see pictures from the sets, but in terms of the text recounting any of the live-action shooting, it doesn't. There's not even really a sense of it actually taking place in terms of chronicling the history of the movie's making. Even for the performance capture shooting too, that in the trenches, day-to-day human experience of making a movie, the shooting of any particular scenes and anecdotes, etc., you only get rare, brief examples done in service of illustrating the main focus, which is how the cameras or other tech and capture processes were used for the shoots. Which, that's all really cool stuff and great information reading about. My point is that in doing right by that stuff, something else has been sacrificed, yet there is no need for this to have been the case. And this is where we get into my big issue with this book that I kind of alluded to at the start, and that is the inefficient, deceptive layout, wasting space that should have been used for more text. And this is so frustrating because the best part about this book is the text, yet all of the weaknesses it has are due to the depth and pacing, which is a direct result of having too short a word count. Because if you have a crappy author, you can give them all the space in the world and the text will still have plenty of issues, but that's not the case here because the quality of the writing is on display, just not the quantity, which is then adversely affecting the overall success and quality of the text. With only some minor exceptions, largely any dissatisfaction with the text isn't due to do with the quality of the writing or the information that is here, it's that it hasn't been allowed to extend deeper and longer and into more things, and only because of what? Laziness, the genre-defining epidemic of, at best, putting in only enough effort to satisfy good enough rather than pursuing a masterwork? I don't know, but the point is it's disgracefully unnecessary and disappointing for this to be the case given the size of this book. Now, if this book was half the size, I would still wish there was more of everything and criticize that it wasn't bigger, but I would at least be praising the wisdom of having the book focus on doing something well, i.e. the discussion of the tech, that the writing's smart enough to understand its subject and dedicate the limited space to going deeper into those things that are most important to the production it's discussing, while at the same time, as I said, being one of the best balances of using shallow, fast, generalized overview to cover as much as possible and explain concepts, while also delivering on an abundance of the more satisfying details, facts, and specific examples. That's all awesome, and something I have so much respect for since most film books are too inept and seemingly oblivious to identify and manage any of that, but I still have to emphasize what this book's lacking because 1. It's important you understand what it does and doesn't cover and how, but more importantly, 2. The book's not half the size. So why is this focus, this compromise, this balancing act having to take place at all? These constraints and concessions are all self-imposed. I mean, that's basically true of every book, but it's just twice as frustrating in this case when the evidence of a great writer and great text are here, and the space to do it all is already here. So why is this an issue? Just because they don't wanna? It's hard to know who's to blame. Is it Jodie Duncan being slack and only wanting to write half the book she should have, which, if that's the case would severely invalidate my previous praise of her as being the right person for the job, or was there a word count or unreasonable time limit dictated by the publisher or someone that she had to adhere to? Whatever the case, the fact of the matter is, this is a surprisingly and disappointingly swift read, especially for a movie that was being actively made for 4+ years, and so ultimately this felt like half an awesome book spread out to fill the space of a whole book, and the lazy, sneaky dishonesty of that truly grinds my gears. It feels like they heard people complaining about how the art book didn't have enough pages and thought the solution was, okay, then for the making of book we'll just double the number of pages, which is kind of a step in the right direction, but doesn't really count if the pages aren't being used effectively. It's just a way to appear impressive initially when you see a hefty book like this that you would hope that's indicative of the quantity of content it contains, but unfortunately it's the publishing equivalent of a bra stuffed with tissues. It's just an illusion to get you excited for something you think is going to be substantial, when really it's just a scummy attempt to trick you into paying more. So to demonstrate how much of the book's space is being well used versus how much is a wasteful illusion, let me hit you with some numbers. Only just over half the book, so like 140 something pages, meet the following criteria. A page that includes main text of any amount or features at least 3 images. That means over 120 pages, again almost half the entire book, feature no text except for captions and are instead being used to show only 1 or 2 images, and mostly it's only 1. This is most apparent when you hit the middle of the book, and for over 70 pages, more than a quarter of the book, it's just images, with caption text, but only 7 of those 70+ pages are used for any main text. Also, about 10% of the images in the book are stills from the movie, which isn't a terrible number. It's more that they're always taking up half a page, a whole page, or even 2 whole pages. Having only half the book feature non-caption text, while the other half is sitting there being used for only 1 or 2 images, ridiculous. And just to be clear, my issue is not the ratio of how much is images versus text, nor am I saying half and full page images are always bad. My point and issue is that half the time they're being used excessively and unnecessarily, and the overall wasteful nature of the layout. Everything in the presentation of this book has been stretched out to create padding just to make it look bigger at the expense of actually using that space to allow the text to be as good as it could be. I mean, it's so extreme that it even extends to the deliberately excessive size of the font used for the main text, which is very noticeable when you compare how big it is to the more normal size used for the captions. And it may seem so petty to call out the font for being 2 points larger than it should be, but I find it truly offensive for 2 reasons. One, because over the course of 250 pages adds up to a massive amount of precious space for a book like this that needs to cover so much, yet is clearly lacking in certain areas only due to not being given enough space. But maybe even more distasteful is, 2, given everything else with the book's presentation, it just reeks of a sneaky, dishonest decision. Because if you use a font of this size, you know exactly what you're doing. It's a calculated decision. You're just a lazy little cheat trying to have the text take up more space, trying to make it look like you've done more work than you have, that it includes more content than it has. So it's just disgraceful how absolutely scummy Abrams, the publisher, has been with the presentation of both Avatar books, though don't get me wrong, the layout and handling of this book is nowhere near as stupid as the art book. I don't want to suggest this is disastrous or anything. It is what I would call passable due to being saved by the great text that is present, so don't let this rant turn you off the book. It's just so infuriating to have text that shows so much promise and is the best part, delivering well above average in its abundance of fantastic, interesting information and insight. There's so much to learn and enjoy here, but that mostly only applies to a few select areas. It doesn't live up to that potential throughout the book as a whole, doing so well in those few areas, but then abandoning that display of excellence for shallow, vague coverage for the rest of the production. And for no reason. The physical space for better coverage and a better book is already here, combined with the incredibly rare instance of having an author who otherwise actually seems to understand how to write these kinds of books, so this should not be an issue, but it is, simply because she slacked off and has handed in half a book to a publisher who has then dressed it up to charge readers for a full one. Like I said earlier, you never know if this is the result of a careless, work-shy author, or because they've been hamstrung by a publisher who cares about making great books the same way McDonald's cares about making great food, include. Whatever the case, it's the author's name on the cover, and this inconsistent handling of the writing and subject creates a very conflicted opinion of an author who, within one book, is both proving and disproving that they're the right person for the job. While in no way taking away from the substantial amount of writing that is outstanding, the inability to have that permeate the entire book does ultimately leave an unimpressive impression that perhaps Jodie Duncan isn't worth the high praise I gave at the start and doesn't care or truly take the duty seriously. Now, despite the rather troublesome layout of the images, the choice of images themselves is another matter. Overall, fantastic in their variety and what they show, though I say that from the perspective of taking into account that this is a movie made in a computer, and that mostly it is a lot of people in mocap suits and green screens and just like James Cameron looking at stuff. But considering that's the nature of the project, I felt the content of what's on display to be better than expected and does add significant enjoyment and interest to the book, though I doubt everyone will be as appreciative and perhaps find them a tad lacking in beauty and interest. Something most everyone will agree on being more visually impressive are the roughly 80 artworks in here, including a bunch that aren't in the art book. The concept art in this book is much more enjoyable due to mostly being better used and even a better selection, particularly because it shows more in terms of design exploration and differences compared to what ended up on the screen. Still only a very little, certainly not a feature, but more than zero, so it beats the art book in that regard. Also, how much you'll consider to be unseen designs depends on whether you include the extended cut of the movie, but if you're the sort of person who would buy this book, then you probably have. The exception to this praise of the images, and specifically the artworks, is the remiss curation decision by Lisa Fitzpatrick to include artworks already featured in the art book, which she also authored. I already ranted about this in the review of the art book, so we're not going to do it again here. You can watch that video for more about that and why it was so repugnant. If, however, you're only interested in this making of book and not the art book, then for you don't need to worry about any of that and can just look forward to a bunch of nice art here. Another thing this book does better than the art book is that the artists are actually identified in the captions. The captions, which were also done by Lisa, are worth mentioning because not only does every image in the book have one, but more importantly, they're mostly really well done as far as captions go, often containing genuinely interesting information. So I consider the captions part of the image and why it's used and what it's conveying. That's not always the case, like with the stills, they're just one sentence description of what you're looking at, or when they just pointlessly repeat information from the main text, but in many cases, the captions actually contain up to a couple of sentences of behind-the-scenes information, or even just giving context to what you're looking at, and so the captions enhance the image, as distinct from many books that don't even use captions or don't use them to such purpose. Even though a lot of the captions offer no more than a rough date and location, which isn't really interesting, I still appreciate it as someone who likes the idea of these sort of books being treated as serious historical records. Even though the captions are significant in that there are hundreds and they often do contain worthy, interesting information, but due to their mixed nature, I didn't think they warranted inclusion in that earlier assessment I gave in tallying the number of the book's well-used pages. In terms of further reading / viewing, there was like a collector's edition Blu-ray that included this tiny making of Avatar book. It's just like a crappy nothing, but I wanted to bring it up because on the inside it says it's an excerpt of the big making of book, except that's not really accurate as, strangely, it includes like at least 25 behind-the-scenes pictures that are not in the bigger book. Now, they're so few and not amazing enough to even be worth thinking about, but I thought that was curious and so wanted to mention it for the sake of any crazy obsessive completists for whom that might be worth knowing. Speaking of the collector's edition Blu-ray, in terms of comparing its behind-the-scenes features to what's on offer in this book, obviously there is significant overlap in terms of what's discussed, so you will read stuff and be like, yeah, that was already explained on the Blu-ray, but it's never in an insulting way where, like, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 repeated quotes I noticed, and I feel there are more than enough unique details present in both to make them both worth it. But in terms of like a definitive which one is the better making of this movie, they're different mediums and experiences, each with their advantages and disadvantages, but for my money there's no contest. It's the book all the way. The Blu-ray is great. In fact, some things like editing and music are much better covered in their own featurettes, and no book can compare to seeing live behind-the-scenes footage, and some of the technology and concepts are better understood represented that way, but overall, this book offers so much more and so much better, which is not what I was expecting. For a book that is so disappointing in the inconsistent quality of the text caused by an author unwilling or prevented from living up to the potential and ability displayed throughout so much of the book, and then having that flame further fanned by some really nasty and dishonorable bookmaking practices, that this book's text is still so good and delivers enough of what makes great making of book writing, It just illustrates the importance of professional, high-caliber writing, and how even when it doesn't permeate the whole book, which is very frustrating and disappointing, yet there can still be enough of it to keep the book afloat and, at the end of the day, insightful, enjoyable, and well worth it despite its shortcomings. Which I know might seem contrary to how much discontent I've expressed in this review, but that's only because, like with the art book, that was just straight up bad, completely hopeless. Whereas here, the making of book is so frustrating because it's such a rare example of having an author who appears to understand the assignment and has the capabilities to actually write a book like this, but only applying that to certain areas and in a relatively limited quantity, and then just drop that and half-ass the rest of the coverage. Needless and negligent self-sabotage that undermines the promise of the brilliant parts in the book as a whole. So my opinion is conflicted because the book is conflicted, but in terms of an ultimate decision one way or the other, does the good outweigh the bad? Yes. Is it worth it? Yes, as long as you're not specifically looking for great depth and detail on those areas the text neglects, but otherwise, unlike the art book, this book is highly recommended to fans of the movie. In fact, I would go so far as to extend that even to people who maybe are more indifferent in terms of how much they like Avatar, but who, like me, still enjoy reading about filmmaking for its own sake, as this offers some great text on a great production, even just from that perspective.